Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Carl Gregory Peterson, Jr., MD, otherwise known as Greg, or Dad, or Grandpa, Doc, and a few others that may not be mentionable. The idea came to me after listening to a tape that I had done on a cassette recorder of my mother. And I thought maybe something similar might be fun to have. So I'm going to put together some of my memories of my grandparents on both sides, and maybe if we have time, of my parents. The idea is not to produce any formal genealogy. That can be obtained by careful research, and probably Xanthi has already done this as a college project years ago. The thoughts I have are off the top of my head, not researched, probably not confirmable. At any rate, we'll start with what I remember about my grandparents on my father's side. Grampy and Grammy Peterson were born in Denmark and came to this country while they were still unmarried and quite young. They were married shortly after arrival in St. Stephen's, New Brunswick, where in the nearby town of Milltown, New Brunswick, they had employment assured. Probably they had some relatives already in that area, because I remember hearing about some Johnsons that lived down the road. They may have lived nearby in Milltown for a few years, but then as the family grew, they bought a place out in Burnt Hill, and that became the home for the growing family and another generation as well, as Aunt Jenny and her husband, Chris Gravison, and their one daughter, Virginia, lived there, and Virginia grew up there. Back to the grandparents. Apparently, when they had a little bit of land around the Burnt Hill property, Grampy began to do some small amount of farming with crops and some animals and an orchard. As land became available nearby, he would add to his holdings, and eventually got to the point where he had become a delivery man for his produce, and successful enough that he was able to drop the job in the mill, and then delivered his apples in particular, I've heard of, were a favorite in the nearby town of St. Stephen's. They had a wooden house that wasn't very large, considering the size of their family. It had a barn as well, that I remember. And at the time that I was a youngster, he had chickens and pigs, maybe a cow. I'm not sure of that one. But I do remember my aunt using a churn to make butter, and so maybe they did have a cow, at least when she was in charge of the building. They had a number of children. I guess the oldest was Anna, and she had one daughter, Gertrude, who was probably a teenager when my parents arrived there after their honeymoon. We'll come back to that later. Then there was, let's see, I'm not sure of the order, but there was an Aunt May who married a fellow named Martin and moved down to Pennsylvania. I think they lived in a number of places, including Reading, where we visited there one time. They had one child. His name was Carl, after my grandfather. My grandfather's name was Carl, K-A-R-L, Peterson, probably with an E, S-E-N, Bjerre, B-J-E-R-R-E. But this last part of the name apparently was too difficult to pronounce, so they dropped it. And I see on my father's records that it was just Carl Peterson with an O, S-O-N. Again, that was more easily understood in the United States and Canada. My grandmother's name was Patria Jensen, J-E-N-S-E-N. And I had the good fortune when I was stationed in Germany in the Air Force to visit their area of Denmark and found a niece of my grandmother's that lived in Varde, V-A-R-D-E, and they helped me find the other side of the family, the homestead on a farm out in Grindsted, G-R-I-N-S-T-E-D, I think it was, and Egg, E-G. But back to the family of my grandparents. There was Aunt Jenny. She would have been Virginia. And she's the one that, when she married, she and her husband purchased the old homestead in Burnt Hill. At that point, my grandparents moved to Woodland, Maine, where he ran a small filling station with 2 pumps and a little candy store behind it that my grandmother took care of. And they lived there a number of years. My Aunt Nora lived in Woodland, Maine. She would have been another one of their daughters. She had married a man named Dan McPhee, who I barely remember, but I understood that he died from complications of being gassed in the war of World War I. Some kind of a pulmonary death. This occurred when I was quite young, and he had 2 children with Aunt Nora that were Madeline and Lawrence. They were the closest in age to me. So I got to know them quite well and shared many happy occasions with them. My dad sort of taking over as a distant but definitely supportive parental support figure. We'd often pick them up when we were heading somewhere and take them with us in the local area, such as our camp on Lake Pennamaquan. Back to the children of my grandparents. The three boys, Uncle Pete, Uncle Bill, and my dad, came along in there somewhere. And the youngest was Aunt Milda, who was quite close to my dad. The Woodland home on the filling station lasted a number of years, and then they moved to a house in Calais, down on the River Road. Calais. In Maine, it's pronounced callus, just like thickened skin on your hand. The situation there was that as my Aunt Nora, being widowed, needed income, and Uncle Pete, I understand, was the primary mover and probably provider in getting her set up in a motel situation. Actually, it was cabins. They had some single cabins and some double cabins, probably 4 or 5. And she would take in tourists, and Madeline and Lawrence helped with cleaning the cabins and making the beds and preparing them for guests. And I remember waiting out on their porch, hoping somebody would swing in to spend the night, and always watching across the street where there was a competition, and hoping they would swing our way instead of theirs. The other factor was a house bought by Aunt Milda across the street that led down to the St. Croix River. She then had her parents from Woodland move in with her. The details, I don't know. The development along that line was not too well known to me. I was the next to youngest and last grandchild on that side of my family, and that makes my sister the youngest. So we were kind of amusements after multiple children had come along. As noted, Uncle Pete and Aunt Phyllis had, let's see, they had Muriel and Forrest, who was known as Foddy, and Norma. In the early years, they lived in Calais, at the bottom end of our street, where Washington and Lafayette crossed. So they were less than a block away, and so I had a fairly close relationship there, even though they were older. Foddy would often include me in the softball games in their backyard, even though I was 4+ years younger than his friends. And Norma was particularly solicitous and caring for my baby sister Janet, and this was good to have some relatives in the town. Calais was a small town, and it had all the negatives that go with a small town. And having family and multiple branches was very supportive. The other family was Uncle Bill's. His wife's name was Mary. And they had Charlene and Evelyn, Carl Joseph, and Petria. Petria was 1 year older than I was, but lived way on the other side of town, which may have been all of 2 miles. So that was quite a bike ride, or a walk, depending on the time of year. But I thought she was pretty special. As a matter of fact, when I was about 8 years old, I thought we were probably going to get married when we grew up. Let's see, now we're down to Aunt Milda. She had married, but didn't have any children. I guess there was an alcoholic factor in her first husband, and there was a divorce, and she remarried a number of years later to a CB. The CBs were stationed down in Quoddy Village near Eastport, Maine, during World War II, and she met this fellow probably at one of their dances that they had for the military. At any rate, he was a good fellow, and we got to know him quite well. I remember he had a war injury and had a metal plate, really the size of a dinner plate, built into the abdominal wall, and that he could thump on and show us where he'd been injured, and the skin covering it nicely, of course, and they'd done a good job of covering the gap in the musculature that must have been severely damaged. He became a local policeman, having been a shore patrol policeman in the Seabees, and I think I had one of his badges from the Calais Police Department that I may have passed on to probably Roy, the first son of my sister Janet. So back to Aunt Milda. He passed away, Uncle John, and in later years she married a man named Bonnie, and they moved to Zephyr Hills, Florida. Now this has been a kind of rundown of the brothers and sisters and their progeny of my dad. And this is a good point to stop for now.